So thank you all for being on time, and we look forward to sharing this training with you today. My name is Nikki Fowler. I've spent about 18 years working with on-site wastewater treatment system design, inspection, and policy development in Monterey County. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to welcome you to this inaugural presentation of Introduction to California OWTS, especially because a structured training on this topic is long overdue. We have a lineup of experienced professionals prepared to break down the whys, whats, and hows of on-site wastewater systems, keeping California's statewide regulations and diverse geographic and geologic conditions top of mind. Before we dive in, we're going to kick things off with a brief poll to gauge how many of you are OWTS beginners versus seasoned pros. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Cheryl Baldwin with CCDEH. So I'm seeing, how would you rate your experience level with on-site wastewater? It's a single choice with a little drop down there. Hosts and panelists aren't able to vote, so I'm not able to participate. So we'll give it about 20 more seconds. Please lock in your answer, and then we'll keep things moving along. Thank you so much. Are you able? Oh, there it is. Thank you. Popped right up. Quite a few beginners. We got 47% people with little to no experience with septic systems, on-site wastewater treatment systems, that is. About 37% with some experience, and then 17 and also 17% of people very experienced, where you live and breathe this stuff. So great. Thank you so much for being here, guys. Okay. Well, there was the experience poll. All right, so I wanted to just first and foremost start off by acknowledging the California Conference of Directors of Environmental Health, also known as CCDEH. CCDEH was really one of the primary drivers in getting this training together, not to mention our presenters today, but the organization was established in 1956 with a mission to improve the quality and scope of environmental health programs throughout the state and to promote uniformity in the conduct of these programs. The CCDH membership is made up of the creme de la creme, those REHS that have direct oversight over their local agency. Members share information, legislation coming down the pike that have a potential to impact our industry and for issues that can potentially be addressed by environmental health. In addition to this information sharing that they do, the CCDEH also oversees numerous technical advisory committees, like the On-Site Wastewater TAC, or Technical Advisory Committee. The On-Site Wastewater TAC meets quarterly for 2 hours, during which time we manage to cover a huge amount of ground. Representatives from about 30 counties routinely attend the web-based meeting to learn and contribute to the conversation. We welcome new members and encourage all counties to get involved. There's a lot of great information there. I currently am a co-chair on the Technical Advisory Committee alongside Mr. Darius Hagihi of Santa Clara County. Members can pose questions to the email group throughout the year, irrespective of the quarterly meeting, to pose questions that can be either discussed during an in-depth meeting or can be addressed, a quick poll, a query, so you can get an answer in real time doing your day-to-day work. During our most recent meeting, topics ranged from how jurisdictions are addressing short-term rentals connected to on-site wastewater systems. We've also grappled with accessory dwelling units impacts on on-site wastewater requirements. We've covered complex topics such as linear loading, groundwater mounting, and even chatted about the head-scratching question of how best to estimate wastewater design on an evolving issue. Public restrooms at a remote electric car charging location, where you have customers hanging around for a lot longer than you would at a traditional gas station. So trying to figure out how to address these and to do it in a manner that we are consistent across the board. The group is a forum to respectfully share ideas, request insights from our peers, and we welcome you and encourage you to participate. So if you're interested, send an email to either myself or Mr. Darius, and we'll get you added to the distribution list and invited to the next meeting. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on the California Environmental Health Association as an integral partner that provides environmental health professionals opportunities for professional growth and development. Each year, CEHA, California Environmental Health Association, hosts an annual educational symposium chock full of relevant information and ideas that can help improve the quality of service that EH industry provides. I encourage you to take advantage of the networking opportunities and that membership provides, and also consider attending the upcoming 2025 AES to be held next April 14th through 17th in lovely Seaside here in Monterey County. All right, with that, we're about ready to dive into the material. We're going to start things off just with some housekeeping. There is going to be a question and answer period scheduled at the end of the presentation. So as you have questions during the presentations, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll make every effort to get those answered in the time that's provided in the remainder of the training. The chat is active, as everyone can see. I appreciate all the hellos and the sharing of correct names and REHS numbers so that Cheryl can make sure you get your CEUs. But we're not going to be actively monitoring it for questions. So before we go today, we'll be providing the contact information for each presenter. So if you didn't get your question answered and you still want to get to the bottom of it, you can reach out to them directly. So we're going to be starting things out today with the basic concepts and regulations. That's going to be presented by Ms. Deb Anderson, who is a registered environmental health specialist and is currently the Senior Emergency Preparedness Coordinator for CCDEH, the California Department of Public Health. After Deb wraps up, we're going to hand it over to Mr. Craig Paul. He's a certified professional soil scientist and an REHS, currently serving as the Assistant Director of Environmental Health for Placer County. Next, we'll have Brian Viverberg, also a supervising environmental health specialist. He's with El Dorado County, and he'll be presenting the principles of septic system design and use. And then Ms. Armida Simpson Van Dam is going to take us home with her presentation of operation, monitoring, and maintenance of on-site wastewater treatment systems. Armida is an REHS, a senior REHS with Napa County.
This morning, I'm going to start us out by talking about OWTS and concepts and regulations and laws. And this is the first of 4 modules. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to be talking about these concepts. My name is Deb Anderson, and I currently work for CCDEH on the emergency preparedness team in the Center for Environmental Health. And as some of you know, we put on the EDDR trainings. We train and support REHS's statewide for emergencies and disasters. But I'm also an REHS with over 20 years experience working at the local level in many different programs. And most recently, I worked in Yolo County as the lead specialist responsible for the land use and wastewater programs. And I helped to develop these programs during the LAMP implementation. And if you don't know what that is, hopefully you will by the end of this module. So what I'd like you to leave this module with is an understanding of what an on-site wastewater treatment is and how it works. I'm going to summarize the California laws and regulations and where they came from, and then also introduce the importance of siting, design, and operation, maintenance, and monitoring. In other words, I'm going to be teeing up my team, their future modules that they'll be discussing. But really what I'd like to do is share with you how just flippin' awesome this program is. I think that it is cool. You have to understand that the public, the mere mortals out there, when they flush the toilet and then stuff goes down the drain, they don't think about it. But we are lucky enough to know, understand, and think about how we can make them safe. So first of all, just quickly, what are they? They are, quite simply, wastewater management systems built to protect people and the environment. They collect wastewater safely. They treat it to a proper standard before discharging it and dispersing it back to the environment as clean water. And as you can see, we have quite a bit of them in California. And what are they called? So they have many names, and this list is not inclusive. But I wanted to let you know that no matter what they're called, they all mean the same thing. Septic system is probably the most common. The acronym OWTS is even pronounced in different ways. It's OWTS, OOTS, OUTS, OATS. I've heard lots. I pronounce it as OWTS. So you'll be hearing a lot of these different names for this training. But the name on-site wastewater treatment is probably the most accurate description of what they are. In the following slides, I'm going to break down this name to help you better understand what they are. On-site. So OWTS are designed to collect, treat, and discharge wastewater on the same property that generates that wastewater. And they're usually found, as the picture implies, in very rural areas. These are areas that are not served by community service sewer systems. Wastewater has been defined as any water that's been adversely affected by human activity. It's anything going down the drain, and it has pollutants. It has solids, liquids, and these pollutants that can be pathogens, bacteria, viruses, or other microorganisms, and chemicals like nitrates, cleaning products. All wastewater is water that needs to be treated. And if it's not treated properly, then the pollutants can adversely affect the health of the environment and of people. And finally, it's a treatment system. It's a built system using media, bacteria, and microorganisms to treat and clean our wastewater to a safe standard. So it's really the ultimate reduce, recycle, and reuse system. So a standard conventional system is shown here. It's the simplest of systems. Wastewater flows from the building by gravity into the built components, which is usually a septic tank and a leach field. The field usually consists of a series of trenches, but the system also uses soil for that treatment. So let's take a look and follow wastewater through the system. So first it collects in the tank where it settles into layers, and then the cleaner liquid product is moved then into the field, and we call that effluent. At the field, there's lots of names for this field. It's called leach field, dispersal field, discharge field, absorption field, all means the same thing. It's usually made up again of series of trenches, and the field is a built component where the effluent leaves pipes through the holes, and the treatment continues in those trenches. It uses media, bacteria, microorganisms here, and continues to filter out the pollutants. The effluent then leaves the built system and continues percolating through the soil. Further treatment as it travels through, removing the remaining of the pollutants. And as the wastewater moves through this entire system, it's treated along the way through filtration, natural biological activities. And the effluent then should be cleaned completely before re-entering into the water cycle. Now, this groundwater could be used as a drinking water source through a well. It could also daylight later into a lake, so we want to make sure it's clean. We also need to make sure that OWTS are built to be effective based on the site features and the soil conditions. And when determining the type of system, location and type that will be effective, horizontal and vertical separation is important to consider. So the horizontal separation is the distance between the natural and built site features to the septic system. The features could negatively impact the system, or the system could negatively impact those the features. So we need to make sure there's enough distance between. The vertical separation is the underground vertical distance that allows for adequate wastewater treatment through the soil. And this vertical distance is between the bottom of the built system to the groundwater or any limiting layer that's going to stop treatment or purification. So just know that every site is unique with its own features and challenges, and some of these features could affect the functionality of the system. So let's look again at this standard conventional gravity system. It is the easiest and cheapest of all systems, usually the cheapest. Given the vertical and horizontal setbacks shown on this site, this type of system will work effectively and the wastewater will be treated. But let's consider some possible site limitations or challenges where the standard system such as this one just will not provide adequate treatment. What if there's shallow groundwater? Well, you can see here that untreated effluent will then impact the groundwater. What if there's sandy or rocky soil and the wastewater percolates too quickly through the soil? Then the untreated wastewater can impact groundwater and drinking water without being treated to the proper standard. So these are two examples that give you an idea of the importance of the site and soil evaluation. What happens at a site when this standard conventional system may not be enough to provide adequate treatment? What can be done at the challenging sites? So there are different types of OWTS and designs that can account for these limitations. And if they're installed and operated properly and correctly, and they're operated correctly and monitored, then they will provide proper treatment. So it's important to identify those site restrictions prior to any kind of design. So if you guys aren't still with me, I threw in this image, wanted to make sure you're paying attention, but also I want you to consider different OWTS designs as possibly building an ice cream cone with different flavors. So again, the easiest, most basic system, that standard conventional gravity system that was shown on those previous slides, could work if the site has no setback issues, great soil. This system then would be a simple 1-scoop vanilla cone, just vanilla. But if the site has many challenges and features, a more advanced ice cream cone may be needed with different flavors and sometimes chocolate sauce, toppings, sprinkles. So this image is a great illustration of just an OWTS concept. It's a reminder that if it's done right, it will protect the waters and environmental public health. If it's sited properly, which means it's built in the right place, meeting all the vertical and horizontal separations, and it's in the best soil, then it's going to work. And Craig will talk about that more in the next module. If it's designed for the conditions of the site and installed properly, then it'll work. And if it's operated and maintained properly, it's going to work. So you're going to hear more about this later. But please know that even then, an OWTS will not function forever. But we want it to work for as long as possible before it has to be rebuilt. So how do environmental health specialists protect environmental public health? Well, first and foremost, we enforce applicable laws and regulations. And in order to enforce those laws and regs, we need to understand and apply the principles of an OWTS, and then also, most importantly, to educate. We want to make sure that our message is consistent and quality message, and we want people to do the right thing when we're not looking. So what are OWTS laws and regulations, and where do they come from? Who's involved? So as discussed on the previous slide, we enforce laws and regs, but to understand these, let's briefly touch on the big picture. So when a legislative act is passed, it becomes a law, and it'll be entered into a code. Government agency will then create regulations meant to implement that law. They interpret it and provide enforcement framework. And as you guys know, state laws can be more restrictive than federal laws. Local laws can be more restrictive than state laws. So now let's quickly look at an OWTS example here. At the federal level, the 1972 Clean Water Act was passed, and the US EPA is the agency that regulates this at the federal level, authorizing state governments to permit, administer, and enforce the program. At the state level, California passed its own Clean Water Act, and the California State Agency with Enforcement Authority is Cal EPA. But more specifically, it's the State Water Resources Control Board, or the Water Board. And the Water Board consists of 9 regional water quality control boards, regional boards. We'll be talking a little bit more about that later. The Water Board has regulatory authority over both surface waters and groundwater in California. And then at the local level, there are local enforcement of county and city laws called ordinances. And other codes may also support the program through enforcement of plumbing codes, general plans, etc. So let's take a closer look at state to local wastewater laws. In the year 2000, Assembly Bill 885 was passed. It amended California Water Code and required that the Water Board develop standards statewide OWTS standards. And this was done in 2013, and it's referred to as the OWTS policy. And in fact, this image is the cover of that state policy. It's an old-timey septic system. Please understand that this is a comprehensive policy and will only be covered here very briefly. So the goal of the OWTS policy is to correct and prevent system failures. And the Water Board recognized that the local environmental health, they were the regulatory wastewater experts with a public health focus. But remember, the Water Board's responsibility is to protect groundwater and surface waters. So the Water Board added into the policy a water quality protection focus with a risk-based approach. And this approach then defined 5 tiers of OWTS, from not risky at all to greatest risk. We're going to briefly go through those here. Tier 1 is septic systems Tier 0 septic systems are existing and functioning with no known risks at all. Tier 1 are septic systems that are low risk, where conservative state standards can be applied to any new or replacement OWTS. In other words, these are the vanilla cone systems that we talked about earlier. The Tier 1 prescriptive standards will work on sites with little or no challenges or limitations. Tier 2 septic systems are those using standards developed by the local regulatory agency through a local agency management program, or a LAMP. In other words, these are going to be septic systems on challenging sites that could not meet Tier 1 standards. Tier 3 and Tier 4, we're not really going to get into at this time, but just know that they are high-risk systems needing oversight. So in reviewing this OWTS policy, it became clear that environmental health agencies needed to make a choice, either develop their own Tier 2 LAMP standards or be stuck enforcing only Tier 1 state standards. So we're now only going to focus on these 2 tiers. So again, the state provided an option through their tier definition. The local environmental health could choose either adopting general standards, and again, these are systems with very general prescriptive default standards. It's the same for everyone. This means that it's a vanilla cone system with no other flavors available. And if a vanilla cone won't work, then there's no ice cream for you. If a Tier 1 septic system won't work on a challenging site with limitations, then there's no OWTS for you. So for example, if a site with a shallow groundwater, a failing septic system on that site that's serving a house could not be replaced using the Tier 1 standards. Or they could develop a Tier 2 LAMP, which allows for alternative standards to be applied with overall assurance that the alternative system options will be as protective as Tier 1. So this means many different options, making many different ice cream flavors, if you will. So I'd like you to consider just how diverse our state is. And Nikki, talked about this a little bit, different soils, different regions, different politics even. Now imagine telling everyone that it's vanilla or nothing. So you can understand why LAMPs are necessary to allow for continued protections. And the first LAMP was passed in 2015. So LAMPs were developed by local agencies to provide system standards that are as protective as Tier 1. So that's what makes them the same. But they may not look or act the same way across the state. Well, why is that? So you have to understand that each LAMP requires approval from and ongoing oversight from their regional water boards in their jurisdiction. And some counties actually have more than one regional board. The regional board map is shown here. There are 9 of them. And the boundaries are organized by watershed. So it's based on the watersheds in that region. And the water board or the regional board then makes their water quality decisions and actions appropriate to those local differences. So in other words, what does this mean? Well, what works for one jurisdiction may not work in another due to local regional board reasons, such as climate, topography, geology, hydrology. So their LAMP would look different than in others. And LAMPs usually consist of an ordinance, which is the municipal law, and a manual. And therefore, the LAMPs need local government approval. And there's also varying administrative procedures. So what does this mean? Well, what works for one jurisdiction may not work in another due to environmental health agency regions, such as staffing, permitting processes, etc. So remember, it's a whole program geared to individual jurisdictional needs. So some LAMP outcomes to provide effective options based on site limitations or risks. A LAMP supports regulatory framework that's unique to the jurisdiction that it serves, providing consistent messaging that will support environmental public health locally. And now, actually, we just talk more to each other. We reach out to our regional boards more. Our OWTS TAC is robust as ever. And even local septic contractors and designers often know more than we do about local conditions. So it really has strengthened the wastewater programs. Quick story time before I'm done here from my time working in Yolo County. So there was a large property, 10 acres, beautiful existing orchard, and the farmer wanted to build a new farmhouse to relocate his family from the city to country property. But during the site evaluation and soil assessment, the qualified professional noted that the soils were some of the worst that he'd ever seen. And that's that picture to the left. Heavy clay, shallow groundwater, as we see. We dug pits all over the 10 acres. Some of you know how that is, trying to find better soil and conditions for a septic system. Given these pretty severe soil and vertical separation limitations, if we didn't have an approved LAMP, then an OWTS would not have met tier 1 here. In other words, a vanilla cone system just could not work. But because we had an approved LAMP, the installation of an advanced system was allowed using a supplemental treatment unit that's showed here in the middle picture to a pressurized mound system that's shown to the right. That's actually the squirt test before we cover that mound. So LAMPs are effective and they are very important. So just briefly in summary, just understand that we know that OWTS can prevent disease and protect the environment if they're done right. And OWTS have many names and looks, but the principle remains the same. They use natural bacteria, built systems, and the soil to treat wastewater before returning it as clean water. And then finally, remember that every LAMP is going to be unique to that local jurisdiction. And just finally, as an inspector, I would often be asked, why do we need that fancy septic system? Why can't I have that basic standard system that I've used for years? And I would just answer simply, we are determining the best system for your site so that it will work for a long time and it will keep you and your family safe, but it will also protect the waters of California and public health. And in this message, all jurisdictions are really the same. Thank you. That's it.
All right. Next up, we have Mr. Craig Paul going over basic on-site wastewater treatment system design factors. Take it away, Mr. Paul.
All right. Well, so yeah, we're going to start out, as Deb did a good job of explaining, every system has to be tailored to its site. And what we're really looking at there, I guess I should actually back up just a little bit. So many of you don't know me. I've been in the industry for almost 20 years, but that's been in various states, not just in California. So I'm currently in California, love it here. But my experience travels basically coast to coast and a little bit in the middle of the country. And so sometimes I'll use words that may be a little different than what you'll know, but as Deb went over, they all mean the same thing. So basic design factors. Every on-site system, every septic system needs to be matched to the site it's at. And no two sites are the same, even if they look that way to begin with. There's always going to be something different. So how do we determine what on-site wastewater system is going to be correct? What septic system works for that property? Well, we do site evaluations. And step one for a site evaluation actually happens before you even leave the office. Before you leave the office, you really ought to learn everything you can about the site. And possible sources of information are existing permits for perhaps that site or something nearby. As Deb mentioned, sometimes those with, excuse me, some consultants have more experience than we do. So talk to your local consultants, talk with more experienced EHSs. Sometimes well drillers have things to say. You can consult some online resources. There's a web soil survey, which is a online tool produced by the United States Department of Agriculture, which shows soil mapping that people have done for well over 100 years for the entire United States. Keep in mind, though, that's a great tool, but it was intended to be used by farmers. So anything less than a 40-acre parcel, it's really not accurate enough. So it'll give you an idea, but don't just assume it's right. Online aerial photography, like Google Earth or something like that, can sometimes show you what you're getting into. And sometimes you'll find that if you look at an aerial photograph, you'll be able to pick out features that on the ground you wouldn't be able to see. Now, finally, about this whole preparation beforehand. Understand it, learn it, but don't believe everything you see. They could be wrong. They could be not applicable to your site. They could be that they were right at one point, like with an old permit. Maybe it was right back then, but things have changed. So this is all information to have in your brain as you go out, but don't just take any of it at face value. Always take a look at what you're really going to look at when you get out there. Okay, so step 2, you actually get to the site. I recommend you orient yourself first. The way I do it, a lot of people do it in different ways. The way I do it is I start as soon as I get out of the vehicle, I will look at the properties around. I'll start looking at the overall area before I start focusing in on the specific spot that I'm going to be looking at for that septic system. Do you know where the property lines are? Are they marked? That's usually important to know. You don't want to put a septic system on somebody else's property. Are there any wells or springs or rock outcrops in the area? Do you know where the neighbors' wells are? Because that's one of those horizontal distances that Deb was talking about. You don't want to put a septic system too close to the well, or it's just not going to be a desirable outcome for anyone. Now, when you're looking at a soil, and this is or a site, this is a little bit exaggerated, obviously, but at the crown, the top of the hill, that's usually where you're going to get the shallowest soils. It's usually going to get deeper as you go down the shoulder, and then your toe of the hill is going to have the deepest soil. And that's usually where you're going to want. You want nice, deep soil for an on-site system, but that also could be where you're working into some water tables, as Deb mentioned, or other floodplains. So you have to find that happy medium. So how do we know, though? I mean, these are all assumptions. How do we know which of these are correct? Well, you dig a hole. That's really the answer. As you're digging those holes and choosing where to dig those things, make sure that you're looking across the street. If you're not sure where something is, you don't have records of the neighbor's well, don't be afraid of knocking on the door. I have never once had a neighbor who I knocked on their door and said, hey, I'm working on the site next door and I want to make sure their septic system isn't too close to your well. I've never had anybody run me off. They are always very happy to talk to you at that point because they want to make sure that their well's far enough away as well. And then you perform that site evaluation. We're going to talk about this a couple of times. Most of the time, site evaluations, and these vary, as Deb mentioned, there's lamps, there's different regs, there's different policies, but remember to be safe. If your policy has you digging holes, do not get into that hole unless it's safe. What does it mean by safe? Well, we're not going to get on the specifics. I'm not going to go with OSHA. We don't have time for all that. But in general, is there a way back out of that test hole? Look before you leap and ask me how I know that. Yes, I did once jump into a test hole that was deeper than I thought it was. It was fun getting back out of. 2, is that soil stable? Is that soil going to fall apart while you're in that hole? It doesn't take very much soil at all for it to trap you. In fact, my boss in Virginia, when I worked there, he lost a good friend for exactly that reason. He was in a hole. He was a registered environmental health specialist. He knew what he was doing, but he was out by himself on a site. The hole collapsed. It pinned him from the waist down. He couldn't get out. They found him a few days later. It was not a pretty picture. And then, is that test hole wide or long enough to allow you to escape if it starts to collapse or to do what you're doing? And finally, don't do what that gentleman I just told the story about. Don't go getting into a hole if there's not somebody around. Again, I'm not telling you can't. If your local policies are different, obviously follow your local policies. Okay, so you get to a site. Sometimes sites are nice and open and wide, and this one would be easy. I don't really have to look around. There's nothing out here. I don't need to worry about a neighbor's well. I'm in the middle of a giant field, but not every site's like that. Sometimes they're like this. There's a lot of things going on here. Are there wells out there? Are there one well? Is there 2 wells? Where are those wells? Is there something else out there that you need to worry about? So as you're looking at a site, look at the whole area so that you have an idea of what you're looking at. But also, do you need to go and investigate these things? Well, maybe. Now, if where you're looking at, you're putting your septic system is really far away from these areas, whatever your maximum distance is for your separation, then yeah, you don't need to go over there. You just need to take note of it. But if it's within, if it could potentially be an impact, if it could be, you know, say if that little kind of dark thing in the middle of the picture, if you're not sure what that is and you're close enough that it could be an issue, you better go walk over there and find out what it is before you just go ahead and look at holes and waste everybody's time or issue a permit. Now, another thing you should do is you use your ears. This right here is a perfect example of keeping an eye. You can't really see this from the road if you're driving by, but you can probably hear it. You can hear the water moving through. So if you're not sure, go take a look. It's better to take a look and walk around that property and make sure that your site is clear of any sort of impacting or use that's not going to be compatible with that on-site wastewater system before you get too far down that. Now, site evaluation itself, what are you looking for? This is a little bit more. One, avoid areas that are going to collect water. As Deb talked about, the whole point behind the septic system is to take water, clean it up, and then put it back in the environment. So you don't want to put a whole bunch of more water where there already is water. Concave landforms are good, convex is bad. We're looking for somewhere that can accept more water, that has additional capacity. Remember, every soil, every spot of ground can accept a certain amount of water in a certain amount of time. And you don't want to overload it. You don't want to create a problem where there already was water. Second, avoid areas with human activity. We're all humans, we like that, but what a lot of what we do is going to affect that soil. It says here traffic and parking areas in virtually every lamp. I guess I don't know everybody's, but I'm assuming everybody's lamp is going to say you can't put a septic system under a parking or a traffic or a road. That's true, but you also need to look at somewhere where do they drive that truck and do they park it there every once in a while? Is this say you're out in a rural area, is this where they drive their truck back to the field a few times a year? That also can compact that soil, especially if they're doing it during the winter. Wet soils will compact really a lot quicker than dry soils will. And those are things we want to avoid. We want to avoid compacted soil because it's going to slow down how well the water moves through it, and that's just going to create our problems. Remember, we're trying to get water to move through the soil. We don't want compacted areas. Another thing to remember is agricultural activities. Tractors, they're heavy. Livestock will put more pounds per square inch on their hooves, a cow, than will a truck. So livestock will compact soil. Plows, irrigation water, all of these things are going to affect soil attributes. Now, I'm also not going to say don't ever put an on-site wastewater system where there's agricultural activity. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Part of my career, I worked in Idaho. There's a lot of areas out there where there was nowhere to put it except in those agricultural activity areas. But be aware of these things so that you can take them into account as you're figuring out how to put the system, where to put it, and how it will work the best. Because again, like Deb said, what our intention is, we want this wastewater system to last as long as possible with as little as trouble as possible for both the property owner and their neighbors. Now, finally, this is something that we oftentimes don't think about until it becomes a problem. What's going to happen with the landscaping? How are they going to grade this site? Are they planning on bringing soil in to make a flat spot for something? Or are they going to cut something back because they want to? Well, both of those could be activities that could affect how we look at an on-site system. Remember, when we're looking at an on-site system, we're not just looking at the soil below, like Deb's pictures showed, where that we need enough soil below that leach field for the soil to actually do its job, but we also need soil above. Also, in addition to that, how much compaction is going to happen in that grading or moving soil around? I was on a site once where they were going to bring in a lot of soil, and that was great. It was in an area away from the drain field. It wasn't going to be a problem, except for that then they piled all the soil they were bringing in on top of the drain field area. And then, okay, well, that's not that great. But then they used really big heavy tractors to move that soil off to where they were going to do it, and they ended up compacting that soil. So to the extent possible, and you don't always know this, but as you're talking to that property owner or that consultant, take these things into account. You're trying to avoid anything that's going to compact soil. We're going to slow down water. All right, we've talked a lot about soil. What is soil? Well, a lot of people are surprised to find out that soil, everything we walk on and we think it's nice and firm, it's actually about 50% open space, pores. And that open space is filled with air or water or a mixture, depending on whether it's dry or wet. Could be 100% water, could be 0% water. 0 is pretty rare, but usually it's about 50-50 most of the time. Now this open area, and not all soils are the same. This is a roughly 50-50-50. Some soils are going to have less pore space. Some will have more. This is just average. Every soil is a little different. But those open spaces are what we call pore spaces. And that's going to determine how fast water or effluent is going to pass through the soil. So this has a direct correlation on how large that leach field or drain field, treatment area, whatever you want to call it, is going to be. Because as those pores get larger and water can move through more quickly, then our drain field can be smaller. Smaller generally means it fits easier and it's cheaper. Not always, but usually. Now, this is also why compaction matters, because when you're talking about compacted soil, what's happening is you're smashing those pores. That open space becomes smaller. You're squishing those pores, which is going to slow down the water so that the water can't move through. We also care about the solids, and usually the solids are about 5% organic matter and 45% mineral. That percentage can vary in vary location by location, but those solids, we care about those as well. We're not just caring about the pores that allow the water to move through, but the solids are what actually removes those contaminants, those chemical contaminants or those viruses or bacteria. They do it through adsorption, absorption, biological processes. There's a lot of ways in which the soil is going to clean that water so that once it does hit that water table or that surface water, that it's cleaned up and good for reuse. So we need to have pores so the water moves through. We also need to have solids so that as the water moves through, it can contact that water and can do its job. So you don't want really big pores that are going to let the water move really fast. You don't want really tiny pores that won't let the water move through at all. You want a mixture. You're trying to find an area that's got a midpoint. Of course, we don't always get to choose the soils. Not every lot is created equal, but that's the idea. So what are we talking about with soil in addition? Soil is not stones, gravel, or cobbles. It's not the big rocks that we talk about. Soils are what we call the fines, the sands, the silts, and the clays. Now, we need to not know if there's gravel or cobbles or stones in there. Those are important. They need to be noted because they will impede water movement. Water doesn't move very fast through those things. It's going to move around them. But for most of what we're talking about and what we're going to focus on today, those fines, the sand, silt, and clay, that's what's going to be the most important for us. Now, over there on the side, you can see the differences. One thing I'd like to point out is sand. You can all imagine sand. It's not very large, but the largest sand grains are 1,000 times larger than the largest clay particles. And they're 10,000 times larger than the finest clay particles. When we're talking about fines, there's a huge, vast difference in sizes we're talking about here. In general, as you can probably imagine, sandy soils are going to have more and larger pores called macropores. They're going to allow for a lot of water movement, but there's going to be less contaminant removal. Clay soils on the other end of the spectrum are going to have fewer macropores, a lot of micropores, and those that do exist are going to be smaller, so water will move much more slowly, but it's going to maximize contaminant removal opportunities, which you'd think would be great, except for that you get to a point where it just gets so large that it just becomes a problem. So what we're really looking for, ideally, is something that's going to be in the middle. We're going good water movement, but we want adequate contact time with those soil particles so that those soil particles can do what they do best. Mother Nature can do what she does best, and she can clean that things up. What it comes down to is time. We need to give Mother Nature an opportunity to clean it up. She does a good job of that most of the time. We just have to give her enough time. So what we're really talking about, and here I'm going to introduce a couple of words you may have heard or may not have. So what we're talking about is soil texture. Soil texture is the amount of sand, silt, and clay and the percentage of each in it. That's soil texture. And then we're trying to talk about soil structure, which is how those sand, silts, and clays kind of coalesce together into larger particles. And that's going to affect a lot of your pores. It's how those things are collected. So first, we're going to talk about soil texture. When we talk about soil texture, this is something that we're all know and love, the soil textural triangle. Now, this right here is the USDA, United States Department of Agricultural Natural Resource Conservation Service soil classification system. It's the one we use. There are others which primarily focus on other aspects of soil. They're for different uses. For example, You guys may hear the USCS, the Unified Soil Classification System. That's an engineering and geology focused one. It doesn't exactly match up exactly to this one. This is what we worry about. Well, why do we care? Why are we using the Department of Agriculture texture classification? We do that because it divides soils according to how they affect water and nutrients, because it was built for farmers who care about watering their crops and getting the water where they want it to, and their fertilizers. And that's really what we're looking at when we're talking about effluent. How's the water going to go through, and how are those nutrients? Farmers call them nutrients. We call them contaminants that we have to get rid of, but a lot of them are essentially the same thing. That's exactly what we're looking for. So that's why we use the USDA system, because it's what works for us. So in general, how to use this, it's a triangle. So sand is on the bottom, clay is on the side, silt is on this side. And you can see the numbers angle with the lines that you should use. So say, for example, I have a 30% sand. Okay, sand 30, it's at this angle, so I'm going to follow this line. And say I have 30% sand and 30% clay. So my 30% sand line comes up here, my 30% clay line comes through here, and they match up right here. That means I have a clay loam soil. Now, obviously, nothing can equal more than 100%, and so by default, we're going to have 40% silt. So all you really need to know is two of these numbers, and you can find where you are on this textural triangle. And why does that matter? Because that textural triangle is telling you what the soil is going to have. What are going to be the micropores? That's really what it's telling you. For generally speaking, the more you go up this triangle, the more clay you get. The more you go to the right of this triangle, the more silt you get, the slower the water movement will be. And vice versa, the faster the water movement will be if you're coming down to this end. Really what we're looking for, a perfect ideal for on-site system, is somewhere in this middle part, this loam area here. Obviously, you don't get to choose what you have when you get out there to a site. You just have to deal with what you got. So, next one. So soil structure. This is the other half of it. And this is what's talking about our macropores. Most of the water, when you put water onto a soil, is actually going to move through those macropores. Now, this could potentially be an issue. Depending on your soil structure, if you have one of those prismatic or columnar, that can allow water to really just bypass the soil particles and get a lot deeper into the soil than you would expect. It could potentially, in a worst case scenario, penetrate through macropores all the way down to an aquifer. And when we talk about that, that's what we call preferential flow. Preferential flow is not our friend when we're talking about wastewater systems because of that bypassing. Now, all of these different things are going to have a different, generally speaking, granular is going to be good. There's a lot of contact between soil contaminants and soil particles to clean it up. Platy is not so good because it doesn't allow water to go down very well. It goes sideways. But you should be aware that soil structure plays a big part in how we look at the soil. And well, why does it matter if this soil goes all the way down? Well, I've got rock under me. Well, keep in mind that rock allows water to move through too, and it doesn't clean anything great. So we really need to focus on our soil. We need to have enough soil below the bottom of that leach field so that Mother Nature can do her job. This is why we dig holes. Now, to point out, if you look at these photos, these are all 4 different photos, 4 different soils. Now, if you're just walking on the top without a hole, the 3 on the right would look pretty close to the same. You're not going to really notice the difference between those 3 just by walking over it. But if you dig, you can obviously see that these 3 soils are very, very different. So how do we know? You have to dig. Again, we're going to talk about safety. Be safe as you're out there. You don't want to get injured. You don't want to get trapped in one of these holes. So assuming you're safe, you're looking at this hole, you get into the hole, what are you looking for? Well, you're looking for soil texture, soil structure, and soil color in that order. Texture first, structure second, color last. The point of this whole exercise of looking at the soil is try to estimate how fast the water, or in our case, effluent, will move through the soil. We call that percolation rate, absorption rate, acceptance rate. They're all the same thing. And the unit for that rate is minutes per inch. That's what the intent behind the whole point is. We want to figure out how fast will water move through here, because we want to design a system which is appropriate for this property, appropriate for how quickly the water will go through. How do we know that then? Well, first, we start with texture. How do we estimate texture? Because it's sand, silts, and clays. You can't even see those things most of the time. They're just too tiny. Well, there's a couple of different ways to do it. One, you can estimate soil texture by feel. This is a USDA process. It's been field tested and looked at a lot. Essentially what you do is you take a sample of the soil, you put water on it, you squish it all up, you mix it all together so you have a nice Play-Doh consistency, and then you make a ribbon. And you just follow through this thing, this whole flow chart, and you comes out with a soil type, a soil texture estimate. So pros, well, it's pretty quick, pretty simple. You don't need a lot of fancy equipment. You just need some water in your hand. The cons are it's really difficult to master. It really is more of an art than a science. It requires consistent practice and consistent verifying that you're getting it right. Also, accuracy is going to depend upon you getting the right soil sample, making sure you've got a sample, which is just the soil you want to look at and from the right layer in the ground. And you can't estimate structure based on this. You have to do a separate looking at the structure, just looking at the soil in that test hole to estimate your structure. This is how a lot of places do it. Other places do a perk test. What's a perk test? Well, a perk test is, first of all, you find a spot where you're going to put that drain field. Now, keep in mind, if you're going to do a perk test, you still need to dig the hole first because you need to know how deep to go. How deep do you dig your perk test? You agree upon that depth with your soil consultant. Essentially, you want the bottom of that perk test to be about where you expect the bottom of the leach field to be. Usually, your lamp may be different. Please follow your local ordinances and local lamp. Talk to those people who have been around for a long time. So how deep do you dig the hole? However deep it needs to be to accurately represent the bottom of that leach field. How wide is it? Well, this can vary. It can vary anywhere from 6 inches to 24 inches. So take a look at your lamp, your local area, and however wide it needs to be. Now, the next step in doing a perk test, remember as you dig, if you're dealing with some certain soil types, you'll get what's called smearing. Construction on a perk test is critical, and this is one of the areas where perk tests can be a problem. If you have smearing, which happens in clay soils, like if you dug with a shovel in a clay soil, you'll notice that it just kind of makes a slick side. And the problem with that is now you've closed off all the pores and the water just can't move out. And that's not realistic. That's not what we're trying to get at. That's not what we want to look at. So when you dig the hole, you need to look at that after it's dug, and you need to make sure that you've raked up those sides to break it back open so that you don't have a perk test that's going to show too slow than what reality is. You also need to do that to the bottom as well. And then sometimes you put in gravel. Some people don't. Follow your local procedure. The gravel is only there to keep it when you pour the water in to the hole, that it won't mix up at the bottom and then cause sedimentation, which will fill up pores. And then you put in water. Again, follow your local. Usually this water stays in for at least overnight, sometimes 24 hours. The reason for that is because water when it's dry will soak soil when it's dry will soak water up faster than when it's wet. We don't really care about what's going to happen when it's dry because we're looking for a leach field, which is going to receive water periodically throughout the day. And we're looking more about a worst case scenario. What's going to happen when the water's on there for a long period of time rather than dry? So you need to keep that water. Now, obviously, sometimes you can't. If it's a really sandy soil, that may be impossible, but follow your local procedures for that. Assuming you've had water in there for however long you needed to, overnight or 24 hours, then you go out, you fill the water up to a known depth, and you measure it. You measure the depth of that water. And then you check it periodically, and you time how quickly the water will go down. And this is where you get those minutes per inch, the number of minutes it takes for the water to drop an inch. That's where you get your perk test. That's where you get your perk rate. So you can either estimate a perk rate by estimating your texture and then using a table, or you can measure it using a perk test. Neither is better than the other. They're just different. They have different pros and cons. And ideally, they're used in conjunction. Some places prefer one, some places prefer the other, really up to your local ordinance. Now, one of those things, I'm going to give you an example of why we dig these holes. You can't just dig a perk test to what depth you think. Well, for example, what happens if you dig a hole and there's water? So we're going to talk about water tables just briefly here. Keep in mind that water tables, remember, we're putting additional water into the system. We don't want to put additional water into a system which is going to do one of two things. Either one, cause a water table to overflow and now you've got water on the surface of the ground, which is effluent, which we don't want. Or two, that water table is going to be close enough that we don't give that soil enough time. Remember, Mother Nature can clean up contaminants, but you have to give enough time. So we need to make sure there's enough distance between the leach field and that water table so that soil can clean up all those contaminants before it hits that water table. Because once it hits the water table, there really is no, there's not a lot of cleaning at that point. At that point, you're looking at the old adage, which we don't like anymore, but solution to pollution is dilution. That's really not where we want to go with this. We're trying to clean it up before it hits that water. So one of the things to remember about water tables is they're not constant, generally speaking. They're going to fluctuate by the season and even by the year. Is it a wet year or a dry year? So if you're looking at a test hole, here you can obviously see there's water tables in these two pictures, right? But is this as high as it goes? What happens if you're digging a hole in the summer and you don't see any water at all? Does that mean there's never a water table? That doesn't necessarily mean that. So how do you know about this? And here we're going to talk briefly, and I've talked very, very briefly about soil science. I could talk forever about it, but these are just the basic minimums. And we're going to get into this one detail really quickly. How do you get an idea if there's a water table there and it's the summer, you don't see water? How do you know if there will be or not? Well, one really good way to know is look at records, but another good way to know is to look for soil color. And this is where that color thing comes into play. So you've looked at soil texture either by texture by feel, you've looked at your test hole, you've looked at the percolation, you've looked at your soil structure, and then you may have done a perk rate, which will test both texture and structure. Now we're getting into color. Soil, generally speaking, if there's no water around, is going to be some sort of a brown to a red color. It could be black if you've got a lot of organic matter, but that's pretty rare. It can happen, but it's pretty rare. But if you have a lot of water present, what happens is that water will actually change the chemistry of the soil minerals and will create these gray colors called glaying. Usually that's how you can tell. You can see on these pictures, you have some pockets of bright reds, but there's also more of muted colors. And on the one on the right, there's very gray colors. So take a look at this. If you start noticing this sort of color variation, you should stop and you should take notice. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's water. There are other possible explanations for this, but it could mean that there's a water table in this area. So if you're suspecting that if you see this modeling and you're suspecting it's from water, you don't have any other reason why it could be there. And another reason, for example, would be if sometimes granites will weather into soils that can kind of look like this, but it's just because that's the way the rock looked. So if you find these sorts of things and you think it might be because of water, then that's where you need to start doing water table monitoring. Nobody wants to have their project put on hold for water table monitoring, but nobody wants to contaminate the soil either, or wants to contaminate their own well or their neighbor's well or the water either. So there's a lot of different reasons why this could exist. I could go on forever about this, but I'm not going to. I think that's what we're going to talk about here. Keep in mind those things, and that's where I will end.
Well done. I appreciate the detailed soils information there. All right, Brian, looks like you're just about ready. I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Mr. Brian Viverberg to go through the principles of septic system design and use. Take it away, Brian.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Viverberg, and I work for the El Dorado County Environmental Management Department. And today I'm going to be building a little bit on what Craig and Debbie have already talked about by talking about septic system design and use. So some of my objectives are to introduce you to common terms, talk about how to evaluate and design septic systems, show you different types of septic systems, show you components, how to install them, and show a few pictures of septic system failure. So I've got a lot of photos that we'll be going through today. One term I'd like to just reiterate is OWTS. I'll call it an OWTS. You might know it as a septic system, and this is all of the different components. That means the septic tank, tight line, and the leach line. Another term is effluent, which is treated sewage that has exited a septic tank. I may talk to it today as wastewater or call it liquid wastewater. We'll talk about dispersal areas. And so this is the area for underground dispersion of wastewater, where it's going to actually go back into the land. I'll call it a leach field, and I may also mention leach lines, which are, you can see my laser pointer, which are individual lines in the dispersal area. So you may wonder, can every property have an OWTS? And in El Dorado County, at least, the answer is no. If public sewer is available, and in El Dorado County, if it's within 200 feet, you're required to connect to public sewer in place of using an OWTS. Now let's move into talking about the process a little bit, where we have site evaluation, and we're going to determine where a parcel can actually have a septic system, soil evaluation, how to design a septic system, how to install it, and then also, again, always check your local ordinances because they can vary between counties. And in El Dorado County, we have certain qualifications for who can design a septic system, and that would be a geologist, a civil engineer, or a registered environmental health specialist. And on the other side of the coin is who can install a septic system. So we require a person to have a Class A, Class B, C36 plumbing, or C42 sanitation system license. And in some cases, a homeowner may be able to install the septic system themselves, but that always depends on the jurisdiction. And any new septic system is going to be installed in conjunction with a building permit, which is a little different than if you're repairing a septic system that already has a house associated with it. So I'm going to move through a few different sections: site evaluation, design of septic system, and installation. And to help keep track of where I'm at, I've got little gray boxes in the lower left-hand corner here. And so we're going to start with site evaluation, where we're going to determine where the OWTS should be located and find the best spot for it. So if you look at the picture on the right, we've got a field, there's a fence, it looks like it's an open area, but in the close field here, you'll see this pipe coming up out of the ground with a cap on it. And that turned out to be a well. So for your site evaluation, it's always important to actually visit the site versus using satellite photos. And on your plans that you turn in for a site evaluation, you're going to include things like where the home is located. That would be this square here. Setbacks from things like wells, and also where you might put your septic system in the future. Now, as Craig talked about, you want to see what you have to work with on your property, and you'll do that by digging a hole. And this will also be referred to as a test trench, and you also might know it as a soil mantle. And so it's going to help you to identify the soil type, how much soil depth you have, and if it's there, the depth to groundwater, which is all going to link into your setbacks. So I've got 3 photos here, and on the left is an example of high groundwater, and middle is an example of a well, and on the left is a lake. So these are all going to have different setbacks, and your local ordinances will specify what those are. But the general purpose is to protect groundwater, surface water, drinking well water, protect structures, because if you put a structure too close to a septic tank, it can collapse the septic tank, and protect the septic system itself. And as Debbie talked about, there are different kinds of setbacks. And on the left, I've got an example of a horizontal setback. So you have a well here on an adjacent property, and the designer did a radius of 100 feet and made sure that all components of the septic system were at least 100 feet from that well. And on the right, we have a vertical setback. So we have groundwater just a few feet underground, and we'll want to keep our leach field a certain distance away from it. So in El Dorado County, and this may vary by jurisdiction, but we have a minimum setback of 5 feet between the surface of the ground and the groundwater level. This is an example of wet season testing that was done when there is a higher groundwater level. And we'll talk about it later, but there are specialized types of OWTS that can treat the sewage and remove contaminants to allow you to reduce that distance between your septic system, leach line, and groundwater. And rarely you might encounter something called a limiting layer. So in the photo on the right, I have a picture. You can see grass, reddish soil, and then yellowish soil. And if you look closely, this yellowish layer of soil is dry, and above it, the reddish soil is wet. You can actually see it dripping down from one layer to the next. So this is an example of a limiting layer that's preventing water on the surface from percolating down further into the soil. And if you have a leach line or a dispersal area there, it's really going to be impacted by that limiting layer. Now we're going to move into septic system design. And this is where our evaluation, soil testing, and our project requirements are all going to kind of be put into one thing. And I've got a photo here on the left, and I just like to give credit to Wilden Geology. They allowed us to use some of their designs as part of this training. So we have a complete septic system, including our house, our septic tank, tight line, leach lines, where our test trench was done, and also where percolation testing was completed, and our septic system repair area. So the components of septic system design are going to be our daily effluent flow. So how much wastewater is our project going to produce each day? Our soil percolation rate, like how quickly water or wastewater will move through the soil. The size of our septic tank, and our repair area that we'll need for the project. So let's start with daily effluent flow. And I'm just going to talk mostly about residential for today. So and in El Dorado County, we base our daily effluent or wastewater flows on the number of bedrooms. So as you can see here in the chart on the right, the more bedrooms you have, the more wastewater you produce each day. And commercial facilities are going to be based more on like the number of toilets or a more estimated form of usage. And a good example of that would be a food facility, which has high wastewater production from all the dishwashing and such that goes on. An example of a commercial facility with low wastewater production would be a warehouse where there's low water usage. Now, how big does your leach field need to be? Well, that depends on the type of soils that you have. So if you have a 1-bedroom house, or I have a 3-bedroom house here for my example, if the soils are permeable, your leach field can be smaller. But if the soils are less permeable, your leach field area is going to have to be a lot larger to dispose of the same amount of wastewater. Same idea for your septic tank size. The bigger your house is, the more bedrooms you have, the more people will potentially be living there, and the more capacity you'll need for your septic tank. And the reason for that is the septic tank is designed to treat a certain amount or a certain volume of sewage each day. And if you have too much wastewater moving through it too quickly, it won't have time to treat that wastewater, and those contaminants will make it out into your dispersal area and can damage it, especially if you have things like grease in your wastewater. So leach field area, I have here on the right a photo of just some calculations that a septic system designer used. So he started with his soil percolation rate of 136 minutes per inch. And then they determined a flow rate based on their number of bedrooms in gallons per bedroom per day. They determined their total absorption area that they needed. So that's the total surface area of soil that's needed to absorb effluent produced each day by the dwelling. And then finally, for the contractor, they determined how long do our leach lines need to be and how wide do they need to be. And if you see this word infiltrator system, that's just the specific type of media that they put into their leach lines. And then finally, the designer picks an area that's going to be the repair area. And this might be the most important part of the septic system because all septic systems have a lifespan. It's usually 15 to 30 years if you're really careful with it. And it's going to be reserved for future leach lines. So if you're building a house, you're going to want to live there for forever. And if you can't dispose of your wastewater, it makes it really difficult to use your property that you've developed. Okay, so just briefly, the photo on the right is a photo of a septic system leach line without anything in it. So you can see where effluent's going to be absorbed, bottom of the trench. Some of it will go to the ends of the trench, and some of the effluent will be absorbed through the sides of the trench. Now for design, I'm going to move into a few different types of septic system designs, and those are gravity systems, pump systems, and finally, engineered systems. So your gravity system is the simplest, and on the right, I've got the parts of it labeled. Number one is your septic tank, and effluent will flow from the septic tank into number two, the tight line, which is sealed, nothing goes through it. And then from the tight line, the effluent will flow into the leach lines themselves. Now, one thing you can note is how the effluent's going from one line to the next, to the next, to the next, to the final line. They're not always set up this way. Sometimes you want to send the effluent to all of the lines at the same time. Okay, the next and slightly more complicated type of system is a pump system. So maybe your house is at the bottom of the hill and you want to put the septic system at the top of the hill. So you're going to have an extra step. So you start with number one, your septic tank, and it flows into number two, your pump tank. And when that fills, it's going to pump the sewage through tight line uphill into where your leach field is located. Now, if neither a gravity system or a pump system works, you can do something called an engineered system, which Craig talked about some. And this is going to provide additional effluent treatment, and you'll use it in areas where you have high groundwater, or maybe you need reduced leach field area, and especially where you have separation from groundwater that's going to be less than 5 feet. And pictured on the right is a pressure dosed system. And if you look closely, you'll see rock, and you see a small diameter white pipe, and then it's actually pushing little jets of water up into the air that you can see. So that's a pressure dosed system, and it will push effluent out onto that rock bed. And this next one is all in a box. So it doesn't rely on pressure dosing. It just relies on these filters, which provide surface area and additional sewage treatment. The commercial system that I've seen with this name is called an Advantex system. And sometimes you need to just remove the groundwater because there's no other way to install a septic system. So in this picture on the right, you'll see a large trench, and it has a sheet of plastic on the downhill side, and then it's filled with these styrofoam peanuts. So this would be called a French drain, and it's a type of groundwater barrier, and it prevents water from traveling downhill to where a leach field may be located. And it might be part of an engineered system. So you're creating a dry area on your property, where you can dispose of wastewater. Now let's move into septic system installation, and I'm going to go over the different components themselves with photos next, including septic tanks, tight line, distribution boxes, leach lines, and observation ports. So starting with the septic tank, it's your first part of the treatment for your septic system. It's going to separate solids from liquids, and it's also going to filter the effluent before it goes out into your leach field. And they're typically composed of two compartments. On the right, you'll see a picture of a concrete septic tank, but they can be made of other materials, which I'll show you. Sometimes you have to put your septic tank pretty far underground in order to get all the plumbing to work correctly. And so if you do that, it's difficult to get to, it'll be difficult to service. And so you can put things called risers onto the lids of the septic tank. So you'll see here these green tubes. These are risers, and they just let you get to the septic tank even though it's deep underground. So septic tanks can be made of concrete or plastic, and they come in different sizes. On the right, I have pictures of 3 different sizes of septic tanks, really large ones, medium ones, and then small. And the designer will pick which septic tank to use based on the size of their project. Now, if you cut one of these septic tanks in half, here's kind of what you would see in the picture on the right. You have 2 sections, and it has a baffle in between. So on the left, you have your solids. On the right, you have your liquid layer. And kind of above, you'll have a layer of something called sludge, which is water and suspended solids and maybe some grease and fats and things like that. And every 5 years or so, or if you're using it more, maybe more frequently, you need to pump out these solids so that the septic tank can keep working properly. Now, you may have noted these little T's on either side. So those are called sanitary T's. And again, this pillar in the middle is called the baffle. The sanitary T's are going to direct effluent into and out of the septic tank. If you're at a hardware store, here's what a sanitary T would look like. Your inlet sanitary T is going to direct effluent into the septic tank. Your outlet is going to direct effluent out of the septic tank. Septic tank is also going to have a filter on the outlet side. And if you look at it, it's got all these fine slots in it. And those are going to keep paper and hair and large particles from going out into your leach field and damaging it. And this is how you install a filter. It goes inside of the sanitary T. And at the top, there's an arrow. And I have this one backwards, but you want the arrow to be pointing outward to allow the effluent to go out of the septic tank. Tight line's an important part of your septic system. It's going to connect the different components. It is a solid, unperforated pipe. That means it has no holes in it. And in the photo on the right, I have a piece of tight line going between my leach line and my distribution box. If you're at a plumbing yard, you might see pipes that are solid that say ABS or PVC on it. And again, it's just going to be used to transport effluent from one part of the septic system to another. Next is your distribution box. You might have heard of it as a D-box, and it's going to distribute the effluent into the leach lines themselves. And please note that the ports in the distribution box are at different levels. You may see something called a leveler, and that is a piece of plastic that allows you to adjust in a custom way the level that your effluent goes out into your leach line. You might know it as a speed leveler. It's not required, but it can be helpful sometimes. So in the picture on the right, I have a distribution box. And to explain what's in here, you have this line, which is effluent coming into the septic system. And the way this distribution box is set up is the sewage will go out this line first. And then when it fills to a certain level, it will flow into this second leach line next. Now, this is an example of serial distribution where it goes from one leach line to another. But as I mentioned before, sometimes you'll want the effluent to go to all of the leach field at the same time, and that would be called even distribution. Leach lines themselves are going to distribute the effluent into the soil. And again, they're going to last 15 to 30 years if you care for them properly. But things like grease, disinfectants, or even overuse can shorten the lifespan of the leach lines. And this is an example of that product I mentioned before called Infiltrator. But the most common type of leach line would be your rock and pipe. So you have rock, you have a pipe, and it works pretty well. It lasts a long time. I'll show you a few close-up pictures of it next. So you have here a distribution box, and then this is perforated pipe. So the holes in the pipe are facing downward, and you want to install it level so that the effluent evenly distributes over the whole leach line. In El Dorado County, our requirement is no more than 1 inch of slope over 100 feet. Drain rock is what the pipe is over. It just provides surface area for effluent treatment. It has spaces in it where effluent can go. It's durable. Here's what perforated pipe looks like on the underside. You'll see it just has holes drilled at regular intervals. And contractors will usually call it perf pipe. If you look at what's printed, you might see it as perforated sewer pipe. And then finally, you put a barrier over the top of the rock so that fine soil particles don't clog up the drain rock below. So that can be paper, or you can have filter fabric, or even straw sometimes. If rock's not available, there are alternative materials. This is called Easy Flow. It's styrofoam peanuts that mimic rock, and there are several other products that companies have developed that do the same thing. And then finally, you have what's called an observation port, and that is a pipe sticking vertically into each of your leach lines, and it allows you to look into them without having to dig it up. And they have a cap over the top that you want to make sure to replace when you take it off so that your leach line doesn't fill with rain or anything like that. If you looked at an observation port from the side, my picture in the right shows it. So you have the observation port, soil, and then the leach line itself. Now, in this case, the leach line is saturated. There's a lot of effluent that's not going into the soil, but sometimes it might be dry, and that could be from tree roots or a damaged pipe or some other reason that effluent's not reaching the leach line. Other construction requirements are a level trench to the bottom. You want your trenches to be 10 feet apart. You want to contour with the land. So if your leach line is on a round hill, you make your leach line round with it. And you want it to be a maximum of 100 feet, at least in El Dorado County. Here's a good example of a leach line that was installed not on contour. So if this filled with sewage, the sewage would just go straight out the end of the leach line and onto the road next to it. So briefly, I'll talk about public health and septic systems with some photos, of course. So the photo on the right is just sewage that's going onto the ground surface. You'll probably smell it before you see it. Here's an example of sewage coming out below a house. Failing septic systems can cause groundwater and surface water contamination and pollute rivers and beaches. So this same house with the failing septic system had the sewage going down into a creek and a drainage, and so you can see how it directly impacts the environment around it. Here's another example. This is from a pump system. And so if you see this line right here, this is a pressurized sewer line that broke due to flood damage. Here's another picture of it from the side. You can see half of the bridge is missing after flooding. And it was actually from the septic system I discussed previously, which pumped sewage across a creek up a hill to the dispersal area. Here's another example of a septic system that was installed by a contractor without a license. The leach field was incompletely installed. It was never covered. Effluent was routed to it, and it just immediately started to fail. So this whole system had to be abandoned, and a new septic system had to be installed. And finally, here's a picture from a restaurant where you can really see all the grease and fats and oils that accumulated because the restaurant didn't clean their grease trap regularly. So this all had to be replaced with new leach lines. So finally, I'd like to say thank you to El Dorado County Environmental Management for the photos provided today, and also again to Wheeling Geology. And with that, thank you for your participation in this section of today's training.
Well done, Brian. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, so Brian's going to stop sharing his screen, and then Miss Armida Simpson Van Dam is going to jump on to walk us through operation, monitoring, and maintenance of on-site wastewater treatment systems. All right, Miss
Excellent.
Armida, you ready?
Yes, I think I am. So thank you, Nikki. My name is Armida Simpson Van Dam, and I will be talking about the operation, monitoring, and maintenance of OWTS. Now, at this point, we're shifting a little bit. Everything's been done in terms of design, installation, and it's been finalized. And now we're getting into using the system. And so this is an important distinction. Okay, so who is involved? It's important to note that everything that's been discussed so far, it ran about months, 3-4 months, something like that, for these experts to kind of be in control of everything. These are all professionals. They're experts in OWTS systems. And so we have the engineer, the designer, we have the REHS that are going to be out doing the inspections, reviewing the plans, and then we have the contractors. But the homeowner themselves, they're not particularly involved at this point. But now that we're shifting to the lifetime of the system and to decades, it really is the homeowner that is going to be taking over. And so it's really important that we focus on what's involved in this situation. Okay. So this leads us to the daily operation of the system. And the main takeaway from this slide that I want you to focus on is the green circle. And the green circle is really what you can actually put into the system. What is safe to put down the drain, flushing down the toilet. And it's really just two things. It's human waste and toilet paper. There's a huge list of no's, and it's much longer than what's on this slide. But the main thing to focus on is what is actually okay. The things that shouldn't be going down the drain or down the toilet, they have a variety of things that can cause problems for the septic system. That can be a physical barriers or blockages for the system. That can happen in the tank. It can happen in the field. It can happen in the sewer lines. You can also overload the system with too much liquid. And again, that's something that is an adjustment for a lot of people. You really have to make sure that you're not running all of your, running baths and the dishwasher and the washing machine and just overloading the system all at once with all the different things that you have. And then you also don't want to be sending down chemicals or things that are going to be killing the bacteria, because again, this is a system that is based on the bacteria breaking down the pathogens, breaking down everything that's going on with the sewage. And so it's critical that that bacteria be alive and that it can do its job. There's been countless stories of people who are on chemotherapy or dumping chemicals down the drain, and the smell that I've had contractors tell me about is just horrendous. So it really is important to make sure you have that balance of the bacteria and the life in there. All right, so we're going to continue with the operation of the system. It's important to protect the system. And so when we're talking about that, we're talking about also not just what you're putting into the system. You also want to protect what's going on with the actual physical system, what's going on outside of it. And so if you have, as mentioned before, if you have heavy equipment, if you have livestock, if you have farming, all of that can damage the system, whether it be the field, whether it be the tanks, even the sewer lines. All of that can damage it. So it's really important to think about, as mentioned before, where things are and not driving equipment over that, keeping animals off of the field. Power outages, something we're very familiar with in California, are power outages. Now, if you have just a conventional system that's working off of gravity, it's not going to be much of a concern. But if you're relying on pumps or alarms or treatment systems, then that is definitely a concern. A lot of people have moved towards getting generators. The problem is if they're just putting a generator on their well and they're still bringing that liquid into the home, but they have a system that relies on power to actually get the sewage away from the home, then you're bringing it in, but you're not getting it out. And what happens is you're going to have a backup. You're going to have problems. And so it's critical to be aware of that if you have, if your power is down, make sure that if you have any kinds of pumps or anything like that, that you are not using your system unless you have put a generator on it. You want to make sure you're limiting how much you water the field. So if it's in a lawn or a landscaped area, you don't want to overwater that area because the idea is you're already essentially watering it within. You don't want to add too much to the top as well. Making sure that the field is unencumbered. So you don't want to go to Costco and buy, a little deck house or something or some kind of storage unit and throw it on top of your fields because it is also reliant on evaporation. And again, that pressure too could be too much. And then landscaping. There are definitely situations where you can, obviously lawn and things like that are great for over the fields, but you don't want to start planting trees. It's not a great place for your potato patch, so you don't want to have potatoes growing subsurface where you've got your sewage system. And the next slide will also illustrate some of these points. Let's see. Okay, so here are some photos that kind of highlight some of the issues that can come up. So the photo on the left is from a rock and pipe that Brian was just talking about. And plants love water, and in California, it's often very dry, and so they will find the easiest source of water. And you can quickly, have issues with roots filling your rock and pipe or other systems when they find that water. And so keeping an eye, originally when you're placing your system, you want to make sure there's not too many trees around, but you also in the when you're planting afterwards, you want to make sure you're not putting them too close to the field as well as for the tanks. They can kind of get into those risers and wreak havoc. So that's one consideration. The other one on the right, we have vineyards. And at the top, you can see that classic golden California, just dry plant material. And in the front of the picture, you see an area where there had been some, it should have been hand farming only, but they came through with equipment, they tilled up the ground, and then they ripped up the system. And this is an engineered system. So instead of the rock and pipe, they have something that's kind of more like irrigation tubing. And so in this situation, we didn't have any pressure in the fields, and it was very easy to figure out where the problem was. We headed out there, we could see that it was bright green. We had a bright green patch. Everything else was just the golden dry color. And we also had plants that are water loving, and that can also really stand out as a potential concern when it comes to leaks and things like that, is if you see those plants. So we were able to quickly locate the problem and then get that fixed. But again, as mentioned before, it's really important when you do have farming in an area where you have your field, to create physical barriers to prevent damage of the field and really be aware of what you need to do for that. Okay, so moving on to monitoring. So as I mentioned before, at this point we have the homeowner that's really the primary person. We don't have contractors coming out and taking a look, every other day. We don't have engineers checking on the systems. It's really the homeowner that has to be monitoring the system, make sure everything's okay. So if they come across a patch of vibrantly green grass or other plants, and it's in the area of their septic system, that could be a concern. Any kind of odors or smells, slow running drains, or the gargling, that's another thing that they need to keep an eye on. And they have ways to, to kind of monitor that. They can also take a look at the field, take a look at observation ports, monitoring wells, see if something's going on out there. And just a side note, lids, they can, over time, especially the plastic ones, break down. So as a safety element, don't stand on them. And it's not a bad idea to take a look and make sure that integrity is good and that they're okay. So this is just the general monitoring. But this leads to the maintenance. So the homeowner should just kind of take a look at the whole system about every 1 to 3 years, having their tanks pumped every 3 to 5 years, depending on usage. They also want to be checking the pumps, the alarms, the floats, rinsing off filters. Now, if they have a service provider, this is something the service provider will be doing. And then again, checking the observation ports, monitoring wells, just making sure everything's functioning properly. All right, when things go wrong. So as a general rule of thumb, if something's wrong, you just want to stop using the system. Make sure you call a professional, probably have the tanks pumped, have it inspected, make sure if there's any repairs that need to be done, that happens. If you have surfacing sewage, the first thing you want to do, obviously, again, is to stop using the system. Try to make sure that sewage isn't running off onto a neighboring parcel, that it's not going into any kind of storm drain. Really try to stop that flow. If you can sanitize the area, you can use lime or bleach. Just try to kind of clean it up a bit. And then block it off. Make sure no one's going in that area. You don't want to have, you're trying to deal with your field being, overflowing and completely saturated. And then your kids run outside and start playing soccer on the lawn and they're complaining that, it's muddy and the ball's wet and smells kind of weird. So make sure no one's actually getting into it too. And also pets. Dogs really like to get into that stuff, as you can imagine. So kind of wrapping this bit up, it's really important that we convince the homeowner not to become a flush and forget homeowner. So they're not in a high rise in San Francisco. They're not, this isn't just going to go away and it's not their problem. So it's critical that they understand that they are an important part of this, and it really is falling on them to take care of the situation if something arises and to keep an eye on their system and, of course, use it appropriately. So one thing that Deb mentioned that I absolutely love is that she always tells homeowners that you are the operator of the system. And so they are now in charge of it. They have that power. And hopefully for most people, that kind of sinks in to understand that they are in charge of it, that they need to take responsibility. There's also the health and safety. Again, you've got, if you have surfacing sewage, if you have sewage backing up into your house, that's not healthy. So you can really emphasize, especially if children or animals are around, you really want to make sure they understand that this is a health and safety issue. There can be legal consequences. So if you have a bunch of sewage that is running into a storm drain or running onto your property, your neighbor's property, or you're a landlord and you're not taking care of the system and it backs up into the house of your tenants and ruins their stuff or makes them sick, that can have legal consequences. And it's really important that people understand that as well. Money. This is a common painful denominator for a lot of people. These systems are often not cheap. So I was consulting with a family up in Shasta County. They were able to get a code compliant system for $13,000, which is not a small amount of money for anyone. In Napa County, however, a code compliant system, most of the time, based on the soil that we have here and the conditions we have here, is going to cost closer to $120,000. So it is not cheap, especially in certain areas where you really do have to put in these complex engineered systems. And then lifestyle. And so with lifestyle, if somebody's putting in a new system or doing repairs or making changes to their system, or just purchased the home, chances they just built the house, they added on something like that. They're thinking about what countertops they want or the beautiful new white couch in the center of the living room. And they're not really thinking about the septic system. But if they're not taking care of the septic system and it starts to back up, that beautiful white couch is not going to look that beautiful sitting in a bunch of sewage that backed up into the house. So again, that's another great way to kind of emphasize for people that it's important that they really are taking care of that. All right, so real quick, one shout out that I want to put out there next month is EPA's Septic Smart Week. Tons of really good information. So if you want to learn more, if you want to provide information for homeowners or businesses, it's a great opportunity to get that information. And thank you for your participation.
Nicely done, Ms. Armida. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. So, really good job. I really appreciate all these presentations today. Clearly, each of you put a good amount of thought and attention into these, going through all your records, getting those great pictures. So thank you for that. One of the questions I saw come through a couple of times was, will these slides be available on the web? Will they be posted? And yes, the answer is that they will. You can go to the California Conference of Directors of Environmental Health, CCDEH website, and that's going to be available on their events tab. So a video of the presentation, the slide deck, as well as the evaluation for today's training will be available there. All right, so with that, I also wanted to jump into some other questions that we saw. One of the early questions we got is, what is the criteria for a standard septic system? But I think that throughout the, the robust presentation here, we really got, we kind of got that answered. Ultimately, I think the question, and Craig, I'll let you maybe take a crack at this. What's the criteria for a standard system versus perhaps a non-standard or an alternative septic system in a nutshell?
So yeah, specifics vary by jurisdiction, but in a nutshell, a standard system is going to be a septic tank and a leach field with no other bells or whistles, usually a gravel and pipe leach field. That's probably the standard for 99% of the people out there of the locations.
Great, thank you. All right, and if that didn't answer your question, anonymous attendee, please go ahead and type it again more specifically into the Q&A tool. We also received the question, can you recommend a solid soil science class or part-time degree? Tough question. I know that's why we're here today. One of the reasons why we're here today, because it's hard to come by good training like this. Does anybody have any wisdom here on the panel?
Yes, that is exactly why we're doing these. Most universities in California are going to have something. It's going to be probably geared more towards agriculture, but as we already described, there's a lot of overlap between agricultural and environmental soil science. That would be where I'd go. Most of the California colleges and universities are going to have something for you. I'd go start there. Being new to California, I'm going to kind of bow out at that point if anybody else has more to add.
I think that's fair. And I will just add, everybody, please, if you want some more information, put that on your evaluation. Let us know what you're looking for so that CCDEH and we can organize that for you, and we can hopefully get trainings like that put together and get the funding allocated for that, because I agree. Soil science, especially in the field training, is just it's one of a kind. It speaks volumes. Okay, thanks, Craig. Craig, I got another one for you. Do you allow a septic system to be installed in non-native fill or an engineered soil if that soil has been sitting for a number of years? And if not, what are the main drawbacks?
So we could go on this for a long time, but I will try to answer concisely. The risks you run with putting a septic system into a non-native fill or an engineered soil is that it's not going to behave as you expect it to. When you move soil, you've destroyed the structure. The structure no longer exists, and you're probably not affecting texture, but you may be affecting how the clay particles or silt particles are attached to each other. So because of that, all of those things are gone. You've moved the soil, and it doesn't really matter how much you engineer it. You can't just magic those structure back. It takes time. And so the answer to that question is, I certainly would really, really, really strongly suggest against it unless there's been enough time. How much time varies on what the soil is, how it was placed there, how much water you get in a year. The only way to know is if you think it's been long enough, dig a hole. If it looks like it's got structure and texture like you would expect, you're probably fine. If not, it's not ready yet.
Excellent. I've always heard the analogy of when you freshly pot a plant in a pot of soil and you go to water it, and all of a sudden it's brimming, almost coming out the top right away. You just want it to soak in. I want to water that new plant, but there's no structure, so that water has nowhere to go. And I think that's similar to that non-native fill. So great. We had a question whether or not any jurisdictions have made changes to their LAMP to account for micro enterprise home kitchen operations, MECOs, and the extra fog that those could contribute to an OWTS. Any experience amongst this group?
As far as I'm aware, no one in the state has made changes to their LAMP at all. I don't think anyone's tried to revise those yet at all, but that's probably coming to all of us.
And I'll just say that this is the type of topic that we grapple with at the On-Site Wastewater Tech. So great venue to kind of hash it all out in more detail. And we hear the pros, we hear the cons. So please join us for that. Let's see here. 11 o'clock. Brian, this was while you were talking, so I'm going to turn this over to you. Is there a maximum recommended distance to conduct perk testing from a dispersal field? And what if a dispersal field was designed using perk test data greater than 50 feet away? At how far away has it become unreliable?
That's a great question. And I would say to that you'd want to put your leach field as close as possible to where you conduct your perk testing. In El Dorado County, our soil varies by the acre, and it can have a lot of changes in percolation rate between one area and another, even on the same property. So that would be my recommendation. I don't have a maximum distance, but probably within 100 feet if I were to give an estimate.
Excellent. Any other ideas from our team?
In Yolo County, we had a policy of 50 feet. And then if they couldn't do 50 feet, then we need the qualified professional to answer to that.
Excellent. Brian, during your presentation, did you make reference to a Ryan formula? There was a question, what's Ryan formula?
I did not. A Ryan.
Okay.
Can I jump in on that one?
Please.
Sorry, I seem to be monopolizing. So this is a perfect example of how a training like we're putting on here for all of California is going to be general, and there are going to be things that are different for your particular area. The Ryan formula is something that's used in LA County and a couple other places for sizing of septic systems. But it's a regional thing, and that's where we can do a statewide training. But at the end of the day, we're going to need, as you were saying, Nikki, we need regional trainings, we need on-site trainings. This is just the first bit of it.
Awesome. All right, more technical question here. What is a reason for using or requiring serial distribution over equal distribution in the distribution box? Brian?
I can speak to this. With a lot of our installations, it has to be a serial distribution just because of how the land is, and to be able to still use it as a gravity system where it goes from uphill to downhill. On more level properties, we have had equal distribution systems, and some counties require either equal distribution or serial distribution.
That regional twist. You never quite know from county to county. All right, thanks, Brian.
You're welcome.
There's a question here whether or not any counties give credit for innovative systems that include water reuse. For example, taking clarified effluent and using it for irrigation. I'll say in Monterey County, we don't offer any credit for that because there's going to be times of the year where the irrigation system is already inundated with just groundwater. And so we want to make sure that the amount of area dedicated to dispersal system is available year round.
Yeah, and we have the same situation in Napa County as well. It has to be sized for everything, and you can separate it out if you want, but you do have to be able to put it back into the septic system.
Right. Sounds like doing so can increase the yield of your tomatoes. So thank you for that comment. It's an interesting scenario. All right, I'm going to keep buzzing through. We're getting more questions as we go here. Requirements on the size of gravel used in trenches. And are there requirements that gravel is pre-washed to prevent fines and clogging soil pores? Deb?
So in Yolo County, we, I believe the range was 3/4 inch to 3 inch size. Gravel. They were usually about 1 inch, smooth and pre-washed, yes, because we do want to protect against the fines. We don't want the soil fines to clog the soil.
Absolutely. Thank you. Why would we not want a garbage disposal installed in a residential home with a tank? Armida? Put you on the spot.
Absolutely. So garbage disposal, primarily people are using it to break down organics. And so when you're taking a lot of waste from your kitchen, putting it into the septic system, it's simply too much organic material. If it's, just simply to kind of get rid of a clog that might be in there, that's one thing, but it's much better to use just those little filters that you can kind of stick in the bottom of your sink and grab material that way. I have heard many stories about service providers having issues with people just kind of emptying out their fridge and running it through the garbage disposal, and it just completely destroys their system. And so, the system's built for taking a certain amount of organic material, and that material has essentially already been processed through the human body. But when you're taking this material before it's even been processed, it's too much for that system. It's too much organic material. And so it does cause a problem. It is definitely a good idea not to have that incorporated.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over a question about adding or removing fill material. So I apologize for that, Edgar, that we're going to skip over that since we kind of talked about non-native soil earlier. And I think this is the last question we have time for is, why is septic tank sizing based on number of bedrooms and not sink fixtures? Brian?
So I would say that it would depend on local ordinances, but in some cases, and especially commercial facility designs, it would be based on sink fixtures. versus residence, which would be based on the number of bedrooms.
In Monterey County, we've always taken the stance for residential development that you can have a 2-bedroom house with 4 bathrooms, but that with lots of fixtures, but that doesn't mean the people living in those 2 bedrooms are going to use the restroom more, flush more, do more laundry. Bedrooms are a good indicator of the occupancy of a residence, and so that's why we use bedroom count for this wastewater design criteria in Monterey County, at least. All right, I apologize we didn't get to the rest of these. I think that we'll need to put together a little FAQ or try and provide the answers to the rest of these onto the website. So a little more homework for the team. All right, with that, guys, we will be, a link to the evaluation has been entered into the chat. Thank you, Ms. Cheryl Baldwin. It will also be available through the CCDEH website under events, and an email will be sent to you directly. Message there, get that evaluation in. Please give it due consideration. They need to be submitted by August 30th. No evaluation, no CEU certificate. Individuals that requested a CEU certificate will receive it by email upon receipt of the evaluation. And if you're interested in getting a CEU certificate now, you can contact Michelle at ccdeh.com. I'd like to extend a big thank you to each of the presenters for taking time away from their hectic schedules to prepare for their topic and share this foundational information to the group. Also, a big thank you to Ms. Cheryl Baldwin and the CCDEH team for hosting and promoting today's event. Let's honor their efforts by giving the evaluation due consideration, and also reminder to indicate if you want more offerings on this topic. Ask for that soil testing, etc., so that we can make sure that we get that training topic available to you all. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring it to a close, and we really appreciate you all coming out today. Have a good one.